The day my son forgot my birthday was not the day that broke me. It was the day I realized I had been absent from my own life for 30 years. And if you're honest with yourself, when was the last time you chose your pride over your peace? I am 62 years old, and for most of my life I believed that being a man meant being unshakable, productive, indispensable, the kind of man who leaves the house before sunrise and comes back long after the porch light has flickered on, the kind of man who measures his worth in square footage, in annual revenue, in the horsepower of the truck parked in the driveway. I told myself I was building something permanent, something solid enough that my family would never have to worry about a single bill, not the mortgage, not the electric, not the health insurance that kept climbing every year, and I wore exhaustion like a badge of honor, like proof that I mattered. But here is the truth I did not want to see. The house grew larger, the bank account thicker, and the silence at the dinner table deeper. My wife used to wait up for me, a lamp glowing in the living room, a book resting open in her lap. Over time the lamp turned off earlier, the book closed sooner, and eventually she stopped waiting at all. And I told myself that was normal, that marriages settle, that passion fades, that men are supposed to endure and keep moving. I missed my son's high school track meets because there was always another meeting, another client dinner, another contract that needed my signature. I promised I would make it to the next one, and then the next, and then the season was over, and I barely noticed how quickly those 4 years passed. I thought I had time, endless time, like a highway stretching straight across the Midwest with no exits in sight. But time does not stretch, it narrows. The first crack appeared in the smallest way, a simple question from my son at Thanksgiving. "Dad, do you even like your life?" I laughed it off, poured more gravy onto my plate, and changed the subject, because men of my generation do not sit around dissecting feelings. We fix things, we provide, we keep our heads down. Yet that question followed me. Back to the hotel room after a business trip, echoed against the blank walls when I kicked off my boots, stared at me from the bathroom mirror as I trimmed my gray beard and noticed how tired my eyes had become. Around that time I came across a line from Seneca, the old Roman philosopher, who wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and I realized I had spent decades imagining disaster if I ever slowed down, if I ever said no, if I ever chose a family dinner over a late meeting, and in that imagination I had sacrificed the only things that were real. I was afraid of losing status, afraid of looking weak, afraid that without constant motion I would be nobody, and so I kept running long after I forgot why I started. The irony is that the disaster I feared arrived anyway, just not in the way I expected. It arrived as distance, as polite conversations, as a marriage that felt more like a business partnership than a union of two people who once stayed up talking until midnight. I did not wake up one morning and lose everything. I gave it away in small, reasonable decisions, 1 hour at a time. And if you are listening to this and telling yourself you are different, that you can outrun the cost, ask yourself one question tonight when the house goes quiet and your phone finally stops buzzing. If success requires you to be absent from your own life, is it success at all? I used to believe that if I just pushed 5 more years, just closed 5 more major deals, just added 1 more zero to the annual revenue, everything would settle into place on its own. But life does not reward delay the way ambition does. After that Thanksgiving question from my son, I told myself I would slow down. Yet the following Monday, I was back in my corner office on the 22nd floor, staring at spreadsheets while the city moved beneath me like I was not even part of it. I remember looking out over the parking garage, rows of cars lined up in perfect order, and thinking how predictable everything seemed from a distance, how clean and controlled, and then driving home 2 hours later to a house that felt nothing like that view. The garage door would hum open, I would step inside, and the air would feel still, almost careful, as if the walls had learned not to expect too much noise. My wife had started eating dinner earlier. She would leave a plate covered in foil on the stove. I would sit alone at the kitchen island, scrolling through emails while I chewed, telling myself that this was temporary, that sacrifice now meant freedom later. That word later became my favorite excuse. I will rest later. I will reconnect later. I will apologize later. But later is a promise that expires quietly. Around my 60th birthday, I noticed something small that unsettled me more than any argument ever had. My son stopped asking me for advice. He would update his mother about work, about friends, about plans to move across the state, and I would hear about it secondhand, like a distant relative instead of a father. I had spent decades positioning myself as the problem solver, the steady voice, the man with answers, yet when it mattered, no one was asking. That was when I understood another truth I had ignored. Authority at work does not translate into intimacy at home. You can manage a company of 200 employees and still fail to manage your own presence in a living room. I began waking up before dawn without an alarm, not because of discipline, but because of a weight in my chest that would not let me sleep. I would sit on the edge of the bed, the floor cool under my feet, and realize that I had built a schedule so full that there was no space left for reflection, and now that silence had finally arrived, I did not know what to do with it. The promotions, the awards, the framed certificates on the office wall had once felt like proof that I was moving forward, but standing in my bathroom mirror with my beard more white than brown, I saw a man who had been running in a straight line without ever checking if the direction was right. It is a strange thing to achieve everything you aimed for and still feel behind in the only places that count. I used to think regret would come from failure, from risks that did not pay off, but regret came from success that cost more than it returned, and I began to see that the real loss was not dramatic or loud. It was measured in ordinary evenings I never sat through, conversations I postponed, and moments that never waited for me to catch up. I began to see the pattern in the smallest moments, not in dramatic arguments or slammed doors, but in the quiet ways people adjust when they stop expecting you to show up. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found my wife already dressed, keys in hand, heading out to a farmer's market 40 miles away with friends I barely knew. She told me she had mentioned it earlier in the week. I could not remember the conversation. I had been half listening, scanning emails while she spoke. That realization did not come with anger. It came with something colder. I was present in the room, but absent in attention, and over time that absence had trained everyone around me not to rely on me for anything beyond financial stability. At work, I prided myself on reading every contract carefully, noticing every hidden clause, anticipating every risk before it appeared. At home, I missed the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses that meant disappointment, the shortened stories that used to be longer when someone believed I cared to hear them. I told myself that providing was love in its most practical form, that paying for college tuition, covering insurance premiums, and keeping the roof in good repair was proof enough. But love that only pays bills feels more like a transaction than a connection. The first time my son made a major decision without consulting me, he framed it as independence. He said he did not want to bother me because he knew how busy I was. That sentence should have sounded generous. Instead, it sounded like a verdict. I had succeeded in becoming untouchable. Untouchable men do not get interrupted. They also do not get included. Around that same time, my doctor advised me to reduce stress after a routine checkup showed elevated blood pressure. He suggested morning walks, fewer late nights, less caffeine. I nodded politely, then went back to the office and scheduled 3 more meetings that week. I thought discipline meant pushing through discomfort. I did not understand that sometimes discipline means stepping back. The signs were everywhere, subtle but consistent. My wife stopped arguing about my hours. She stopped asking when I would be home. She stopped expecting change. When conflict disappears without resolution, it is not peace. It is withdrawal. I had mistaken quiet for harmony. I had mistaken tolerance for respect. I had mistaken endurance for strength. One evening I sat alone in the living room, the television on but muted, watching my own reflection in the dark screen. The house was well furnished, carefully maintained, exactly what I had worked for, yet it felt staged, like a model home where no one truly lives. I realized that while I had been building security, I had neglected presence, and presence is the only currency that cannot be stored for later use. You either spend it in the moment or you lose it forever. I remember the exact evening when the illusion finally cracked, not with shouting or drama, but with a calm conversation at the dining room table where my wife spoke in a voice so steady it felt rehearsed. She told me she was tired, not physically tired, but tired of living beside someone who was always preparing for tomorrow and never fully present today. She did not accuse me. She did not raise her voice. She simply described a life where she felt alone even when I was sitting 3 feet away. I wanted to defend myself with numbers, with proof of what I had provided over the years, with reminders of the vacations we had taken and the house we had paid off ahead of schedule. But as she spoke, I realized none of those achievements answered what she was actually saying. She was not questioning my effort. She was questioning my presence. There is a difference, and I had never taken the time to understand it. In the weeks that followed, we moved through the house like respectful roommates. We coordinated schedules. We discussed bills. We avoided depth. The space between us felt organized, almost polite, which made it more unsettling. One night, I walked through each room after she had gone to bed, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the kitchen counter, the framed photos along the hallway. In those photos, I saw younger versions of us smiling at a beach in California, standing beside a rented cabin in Colorado, cheering at my son's middle school graduation. The pictures showed happiness, but they did not show the hours. I had been mentally elsewhere, calculating projections, planning expansions, chasing the next milestone. It is possible to stand inside a memory and still not fully live it. That realization settled heavily on me. A few months later, she suggested we try living separately for a while. She said it gently, as if offering a practical solution rather than announcing an ending. I nodded because I did not know what else to do. I moved into a smaller place across town, a quiet rental with thin walls and a narrow balcony that overlooked a grocery store parking lot. The first night there, I unpacked only what I needed: a suitcase of clothes, my shaving kit, a stack of books including the writings of the Roman philosopher I had recently begun reading. The apartment echoed when I set my keys down on the kitchen counter. No one asked how my day had been. No one commented on how late I stayed at the office. I had gained total control over my time, and for the first time, I understood how empty control can feel when there is no one left to share it with. I had spent decades fearing failure, yet the real failure had been quieter and far more personal, and it was waiting for me in that silent room. The first week in that small apartment felt like standing in an empty church after everyone had left, quiet, echoing, almost respectful in its stillness. I kept expecting noise that never came: the sound of someone moving in the kitchen, the soft rhythm of another person breathing in the next room. But there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant beeping of delivery trucks backing up behind the grocery store. Without the structure of family life around me, I began to notice how much of my identity had been tied to motion. I would wake up at 5:30 in the morning out of habit, lace up my boots, and then realize there was nowhere urgent to be. No one depended on my schedule anymore. I had chased control for decades, and now I had complete control over my time. Yet the freedom felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. That was when I started reading more seriously, not to collect quotes or sound intelligent, but to understand what had gone wrong inside me. One passage struck me with a force that felt personal. It suggested that we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the judgments we attach to them. I had judged rest as weakness, judged emotional presence as distraction, judged vulnerability as risk. Those judgments shaped every decision I made. Sitting on that narrow balcony overlooking rows of shopping carts and asphalt, I began to ask myself what would have happened if I had judged differently. What if leaving the office at 5 in the afternoon had not meant laziness, but wisdom? What if saying no to one more contract had meant saying yes to dinner at home? I realized I had built my life around imagined catastrophes. I feared financial instability even when our savings were solid. I feared losing status even when no one was challenging me. I feared being ordinary more than I feared being alone. That fear drove me forward like an invisible engine, powerful but blind. The apartment forced me to confront a slower rhythm. I cooked simple meals instead of eating late takeout at my desk. I walked through nearby neighborhoods in the evenings, passing small houses with porch lights glowing warmly, hearing families talking through open windows. Those ordinary scenes felt distant from the life I had chosen, yet they also felt honest. For the first time, I did not measure my day by productivity or revenue, but by awareness. I paid attention to how the air felt at sunset, to how my chest tightened when I thought about conversations I had avoided for years. It became clear that the real problem had never been long hours or ambition alone. It was the belief that achievement could replace connection. I had treated time like a tool to be optimized instead of a gift to be experienced. In that quiet apartment, stripped of noise and applause, I began to understand that the hardest truth was not that I had failed others, but that I had misunderstood what success was meant to protect. In this reflective and emotionally grounded narrative, an aging father confronts the quiet cost of a lifetime spent chasing achievement while neglecting presence, revealing a powerful life lesson about ambition, identity, and the price of emotional absence. Through the steady voice of a 62-year-old businessman living alone after separating from his wife, and the silent distance growing between him and his son, this story explores how success can mask disconnection and how pride can slowly erode intimacy without a single dramatic moment. As the husband looks back on missed dinners, overlooked conversations, and the gradual withdrawal of the woman he shared decades with, he uncovers a life lesson that many men only recognize when the house becomes quiet and the calendar is suddenly empty. Guided by the timeless reflections of a Roman philosopher whose words challenge fear, ego, and imagined catastrophes, the father begins to understand that control is not the same as strength and that financial security cannot replace emotional presence. This deeply personal account offers a life lesson about redefining success beyond income, titles, and productivity, urging men to reconsider what they are protecting when they sacrifice time with family. As the separated husband adjusts to a smaller apartment and confronts the stillness he once avoided, he discovers a life lesson about judgment, perception, and the invisible, narratives that drive relentless work. Through subtle moments rather than dramatic conflict, the father's journey becomes a universal life lesson for men who measure themselves by output instead of connection. This story speaks directly to husbands, fathers, and professionals who sense that something feels off despite outward achievement, offering a final life lesson that time cannot be stored, postponed, or negotiated, only lived with intention before it quietly moves on. Create me a realistic 62-year-old white American man, long gray beard, calm serious expression, wearing a simple dark flannel shirt and denim jeans, front-facing portrait, natural lighting, authentic skin texture, masculine presence. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, cinematic photography style. Character 1.